The man who had once been called Dalen stumbled out of the decrepit brothel and onto the warm, sandy street. One thing that monster's money was good for was obtaining good booze and good women, though this fine establishment couldn't be said to offer either. He stopped in the center of the street and stared up at the burning sun overhead. He swayed with the wind. He could faintly hear the rhythm of waves crashing against rocks and sand. His mind and body were still severely altered by the bottle that dangled from his limp hand. The sky was so blue on Pyrrhica, a blue so blue it almost seemed fake, like someone had replaced the real sky with an overdone painting. His eyes burned. A thought arose in his mind, urging him to look away from the painful ball of fire, but he ignored it. Right now, he liked the pain. He liked to feel it. The booze burned away most of it anyway. The cracked sandstone bricks used to pave the street started to burn his bare feet as well. With a sigh, he unsteadily hobbled across the thruway, being cursed at by a wagon driver. He wandered past a thin sheet that acted as the tavern's door. As soon as he entered, he was accosted by the scent of liquor, sweat, and vomit, a smell he had begun to associate with numbness. No sooner had he walked in, however, did a thickly accented and burly voice shout at him.
"Get lost, stranger. If the birth will kick your wanderlust ass out, then you're too far gone to be drinking here."
Stranger was the name the people of this small slaving island had given to him after he refused to give them one himself. He stood there swaying for several moments before a firm hand laid on his shoulder and promptly threw him out the door and onto his wanderlost ass.
"Scaled gilly,"
Dalen mumbled under his breath. He had taken well to the local curse words, many of which were based on ancient Pyrrhican mythology, which he found... No, he didn't find it fascinating. He didn't find it anything. It was just something that he liked. That was that. He had come to Pyrrhica to do nothing. He didn't need a reason. He didn't want a reason. Reasons were for people with meaning. He didn't have meaning. He didn't want meaning. Meaning was for priests and philosophers. He was not a priest, and he most certainly was not a philosopher. Not now. Not ever again. He tried to sit up, but his weak limbs decided against that course of action and collapsed again onto the ground. He lazily pulled his bottle to his lips. It was nearly empty, of course. He cursed Brokken and rolled over onto his side in an attempt to avoid the worst of the midday sun's wrath. Then he drifted into sweet unconsciousness. His dreams were plagued by lives he had lived, lies he had believed, all to the sound of that monster's nauseating laughter. The only respite came from the low, haunted voice of a man he hardly knew saying,
"You get to choose."
But what if he didn't want to choose anymore? He had chosen not to die. But was this really better?
Don't waste it.
That same voice whispered to his sleeping mind. But he already had. This was who he was. The real him. And he hated it. Grimace walked down the well-worn dirt road, her long steps taking her much further than those of the hapless refugees she traveled with. They had all but flooded through the Hengegate in Vastrin, fleeing from some form of revolt that was occurring on Elias. The poor sods. They were the last group to make it through, before the Queen shut down all travel from Elias, trapping countless hundreds of poor sods on the other side. She hadn't heard much about the actual revolt. Apparently there was some idiot claiming he was Brokken's heir, going around conquering cities. She cared little about human politics. But all these fools were without jobs or homes. much like Grimace herself. She had nowhere left to go after the bloodbath. Nothing left to do. She knew better than to travel the wilds by herself, though most footpads would think twice before trying to jump an Orden. She had asked to travel with several different caravans out of Vastran. Some ran away screaming, calling her a Faeden. Others spat at the ground, mumbling Beshen under their breath. Others still asked her to leave because she was scaring the children. All said no, except for this one. They were all refugees with no wagons or wares to their names. They were hesitant at first too, but they soon realized having an Orden with them would make their group less desirable a target. And so she walked ahead of them, dust pluming beneath her every step. Several had taken to calling her Rav, a short form of Ravager, which was the title held by her more feral cousins that roamed the countryside. Others called her Besh, a barely more appropriate version of Beshen. The word Beshen itself had quickly dropped from their vocabulary after she nearly ripped a man's arms off for calling her that. In hindsight, she supposed that wasn't the best way to prove she was no mindless beast. A number of them even settled on her old nickname, Grimace, a name she didn't love, but had grown to accept. They were headed east. No specific stop in mind, just east. There were a number of villages and larger towns out this way. Members of the caravan would stop when they felt it was right, or when they found work. Their meager group had lost nearly half its original members this way, and she was glad for it. She wasn't entirely convinced she would ever stop. There were very few places that would accept an Orden with open arms, and most of these were circuses or menageries. She longed to go to the clanlands that her mother used to tell her stories about, where Orden dwelled within and built upon ancient Woden cities. But she, like generations of her kin before her, were clanless. A clanless in the clanlands would most likely invite even more hostility than the humans showed her. Maybe even more than the Elken. She spat to the side, thinking of the filthy Elken. Just because they grew horns, they thought they were the heir of the gods. There was so much they had forgotten. The Orden were the true stewards of the Woden's history and culture. They built their cities and smithed their weapons. They tilled their fields and recorded their songs. The Elken were just a filth not strong enough to ascend. Many people misunderstood the Orden's reverence for the Woden. Yes, it was true that the Orden were seen as less than slaves, and yet they alone were entrusted with the Woden's deepest secrets. The Woden created them to be Beshen of burden, the perfect workforce. Strong beings that didn't question or complain, beings who lived long and reproduced fast. Instead, they created beings who would be singular in their focus, devotion, and loyalty. Beings that would carry their culture into the future. Unlike the Staguls and Mockers or Workboars, Orden had immortal souls and intelligent minds. They were the Woden's greatest creation, and they wore that as a badge of honor. They may have been created to be Beshen, but they were not Beshen. Of course, all this idealization of the Orden race merely applied to the great clans, not to lowly clanless like her. She heard a low, thundering sound that stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't. No, it couldn't be. A bead of sweat rolled down the thick gray skin of her white face. The refugees behind her noticed her and stopped in the road as well. She tightened her enormous hands around the thick quarterstaff she held. She heard another loud banging sound, and she feared her two hearts would stop beating. That sound. It was a sound she had feared ever since she was a small girl. A sound she had heard all too often growing up in the wilderness with the clanless. The raid drums of the Ravager.
Run!
She bellowed in a deep voice. The tempo of the beat picked up quickly, and she heard the terrible growls of the creatures ahead. She turned on her heels and pointed her quarterstaff back the way they had come. The refugees snapped out of their stupor and charged ahead of her in a panic. She had heard stories all her life of the noble Orden who refused to fight or do battle. They believed that Orden hands were for building, never destroying. Only the Cossentor of a clan could fight. She was no Cossentor, but she was all these people had. And the beast that broke out of the woods behind them were no longer Orden. She heard the growls and grunts of the Ravager gaining ground. She dared not look over her shoulder. Then she planted her foot and spun around, swinging her quarterstaff with all her might. She caught a glimpse of the creature before her staff connected with its head. He had a pale green coloring, hardly a scrap of clothes over his long form. He was scrawny for an Orden, and he had been running on all fours, claws digging into the dirt. She felt an ounce of remorse for the poor creature, before the tip of her staff crushed his skull, sending him flying with chips of broken tusk and bone. 3 more Ravagers emerged from the wood. They stood on 2 legs, though they were hunched over. One played a drum, while the other 2 beat crude swords and clubs against their chest. She may be clanless, but even she was not as low as these creatures. She gritted her teeth in anger and excitement, then charged towards the Ravagers. Veltorus walked into the plain, dull gray ministry building. It was nothing to look at, but that was how the ministry liked it. The exterior was bland and unassuming, while the interior was equally bland and unassuming. It was perfectly utilitarian to the core. His footsteps echoed down the long, dimly lit hall. As he walked, he tossed the soul shard he had recovered up into the air, letting the oblong crystal turn end over end before returning safely to his hand. Soul shards were rare, but any time there was a breach or strong enough disturbance between the mortal world and the Veil, there was a small chance for one to materialize. Killing Faeden often counted as a strong enough disturbance, and he had accumulated quite the collection over the years. They were phenomenal catalysts for pulling energy through the Veil. As such, artificers and enchanters would pay a small fortune for a shard like the one he carried now. But he didn't care much for their money. Each one was symbolic of death to him. A trophy in some ways, a morbid reminder in others. This one was all that remained of the Karna he had killed. The one Martonus had failed to kill. It hurt him more than he would have admitted to anyone to see a man he had once considered a friend fall into madness. That pain was twofold. One for the slow descent and forgotten memories of a man he respected more than any other, but 2, because that was the future that awaited him as well. Martonus was far older than Veltorus, and he presumably had several decades of a clean mind ahead. But the possibility was daunting. For all of Martonus's gruff exterior, he was truly a sympathetic man, never wanting to take more life or cause more damage than was necessary. Usually. While Veltorus was training under him, he had seen him risk his own life to save just one innocent person, while other times he would tear through a mass of bodies like butter, not caring who those bodies belonged to. He was an oddly complex man, but at his core he had a good heart, which was more than could be said for most keepers or ministry workers. He greatly looked up to Martonus, but he knew that all good things eventually came to an end. He tried to make him proud in the handling of the Karna. He only killed 13 people, 4 of which were hosts the damned Faeden had jumped to. The others simply got in his way, trying to protect the cursed thing. But there were far fewer casualties than would have been allowed, or even expected, of such a task. He pushed through the thick oak door of the minister's office without knocking. The tall man glanced up at him from his desk. The office was sparsely finished, as all rooms within the ministry building were. Veltorus approached the desk and tossed down the shard on its cold steel surface. It didn't feel right, adding this one to his collection.
Well done, Veltorus. It must feel good to succeed where your mentor failed,
the minister said in his high accent. Accomplishment was always rewarding, but this was different.
Not exactly,
he replied. He turned around and headed back towards the door he had entered through.
One moment, Keeper.
Veltorus stopped and turned back to face the minister.
I have another assignment for you.
A slight sense of dread started to build within his subconscious, and his reaper rumbled from the depths of his mind.
Well, that was fast.
Martonus. I assume you heard the report about his safe house's destruction?
Veltorus sighed. He had heard. The house had gone up in an inferno. Now it was nothing but ash and stone, presumably with Martonus inside it. Veltorus wasn't so sure. It just didn't feel right. His reaper rumbled its agreement.
I did.
We have reason to believe he did not die in the fire.
Veltorus closed his eyes. Of course, he had his own suspicions, but he had hoped no one else would have the same. An idle hope, he knew, but even still, Martonus deserved better than what he assumed the ministry intended to do with him.
He's gone mad, Veltorus. The most dangerous keeper in our employ has thrown his lead.
Veltorus knew where this was going. He knew Martonus better than nearly anyone. Yes, many of the other keepers had known him for as long or longer than himself, and he had aided in many of their own bindings. But Veltorus was the only one to personally train with him. He knew how he thought, how he operated. His reaper seethed at the notion. The reapers all treated him almost as one of their own for destroying the nameless and freeing them from their bonds to him.
Even if I was willing to hunt down Martonus, you know the way that the other reapers respect him.
The reapers know that their duty supersedes their loyalty to one man. Do you?
Did he? Both he and his reaper hated the idea. It was Martonus for Brokken's sake. Could they really turn against him after all he had done for all of them? But Veltorus knew the minister was correct. This was the entire duty of a keeper, to prevent rogue Faeden from causing destruction in the mortal world, even if that meant going against one of their own. He respected the man Martonus had been, and he would do this for that man, not the monster he had become. He sighed, and his reaper reluctantly agreed.
Dead or alive?
The result will be much the same either way. You know that.
I'll see what I can do.
He turned to leave.
No, you will do what needs to be done. Nothing more and nothing less than Martonus would have done himself in your place. This is for the best, Veltorus.
He was right. This was what Martonus would have done. He would have hated it, and he would have tried to find another way out. But in the end, Martonus always did what was best for the Empire, and so would Veltorus. An instant of pain, a lifetime of darkness, memories as fleeting as mortality. Names and eyes flashed through his mind with the red and purple lightning. Martonus tore out of the veil screaming. Traveling through the veil was a terrible experience for the sanest of minds, and Martonus was far from that. Despite it being his home, Reaper fared a little better, his screams echoing Martonus' own as he forced himself back within the depths of his soul. Martonus fell to his knees, heaving. He looked up, taking in his surroundings. Behind him were the towering spires of Eldaruun, imposing against the overcast sky. Ahead of him and much closer than the city was the small village that had set itself up on the outskirts of the forest. He had visited the village on a number of occasions following leads, but he never enjoyed the experience. It housed the kinds of dregs that fed off of disorder, such things that Brokken and his empire stood in direct opposition to. The governors had proposed running off its inhabitants and burning the sad sight to the ground, but the church had yet to agree with this course of action. It was a lawless place, full of sickness and rot, a blight upon Brokken's greatest city. If Tatarin had left the city, which Martonus had no doubt he had, he most likely would have come this way. He picked himself up, finding what little strength remained within him with Reaper's help, and stumbled his way towards the village of shacks and tents. Entering the Vale fully always left both he and Reaper extremely drained, since he was not in the mortal world to keep them both grounded. But they would recover with time. He drew scores of glances full of disdain and hatred. His dark clothes were not especially nice, but they marked him as someone with more wealth than anyone in this Brokken-forsaken place. Shadows stretched long, despite the position of the sun behind layers of clouds, and pooled together before him. Reaper's form emerged from those shadows, towering and impossibly dark. His eyes blazed with heat and light. Only Martonus could see him, of course, a point made obvious by the lack of screaming and fleeing in fear of the denizens around them. Martonus's eyes glazed red as Reaper's power and presence surged.
Hunt,
Martonus said, and with that word, Reaper's form disappeared into the village, searching for any trace of their prey. Martonus felt him move, saw through his red-tinted eyes, felt his insatiable hunger. So many souls, ripe for the taking. He knew deep down that Reaper didn't want to kill innocent people. But the more that Martonus lost his mind to the madness, the closer Reaper came to becoming the mindless monstrosity he had once been. Were Martonus to simply die as the ministry intended, Reaper would be pulled fully back into the Vale, where he would lose himself again, but where he could no longer hurt anyone other than other Faeden. Obviously, that would be better for everyone, compared to the alternative. But Martonus wasn't finished. Not with that Hemomancer on the loose. He didn't know what the ministry had planned for him, but he was more than just a weapon or a tool. Martonus tried to avoid religion and politics whenever he could, but this whole situation smelled too much like conspiracy for his liking. He would get to the bottom of this, or he would die trying. Better for everyone would be the latter, he assumed. Reaper screamed. Martonus focused through his eyes. He saw faint trails of soul energy rising from one of the countless canvas shacks. Most orders of magic called this ability soul sight. It was the power to see the spiritual tethers that connect a mortal to the other world. The more powerful a person's soul, the easier it was to see. But traditional soul sight didn't hold a candle to Reaper's ability to peer through the veil itself. More than just seeing souls, he could sense their trails, their nature, their absence. He could sense blood and other vessels that contain soul energies. It was an impeccable skill for a hunter. Not to mention that Faeden themselves were all but invisible to others using soul sight, except for very rare cases. Having a Faeden that could move unseen while peering into the veil was an invaluable tool. Martonus blinked away Reaper's sight, returning his vision to his own body, and worked his way through the crowd towards the shack. It was tattered and small, with a rickety stand out in front of it that the inhabitant used to sell their gruesome product. A butcher. The slabs of rotting meat on display turned Martonus' stomach. Despite the quality of the meat, or lack thereof, the cuts themselves were clean and precise. This wasn't just an ordinary butcher. This was an artist, a true butcher. He saw Reaper's shadowy form looming over the small stand, as if waiting to pounce. Martonus approached and rang the small brass bell that sat on the stand. A scrawny, pale man appeared from behind a canvas flap. His dirty apron was stained dark brown with dried blood. Butchery as an art had originated in a swamp in southern Apis, place that later became known as Butcher's Bog. Brokken had tried to stomp out the brutal practice during his first unification war, but legend said that Crom himself tore through the otherworld to defend the place. More likely, however, was that the swamp was very difficult terrain to carry out military operations in, and so Brokken retreated, not wanting to waste good troops on such a small settlement. The butchering arts had spread far and wide, however. Many butchers are just that, butchers, but the culture of the bog taught that butchery was more than just cutting animal meat. Many true butchers pursue their art on the most prized meat, that of human, Elken, and even Orden. They weren't cannibals or anything like that. They simply exulted in blood and killing. Unlike zealots, sanguines, and hemomancers, butchers did not benefit from the blood they drew. They didn't use magic, as they sought a dishonorable way of killing. They drew blood just for the pleasure of it. Martonus thought them all nothing more than brutal animals.
I'm looking for a very specific cut of meat. Some locals said you would be the guy to talk to.
Martonus said. The butcher weighed him through narrowed eyes.
What kind of cut?
Martonus looked around, as if nervous.
The kind that would be better to talk about behind closed doors.
Don't have any doors. The best I can do is a canvas flap,
he said dryly, pushing the canvas aside with his arm, still eyeing Martonus. He entered into the small shack, and the butcher closed the flap behind him. Then he buried a meat cleaver into Martonus' shoulder. Blood sprayed up into Martonus' face, and he lurched forward, screaming in pain.
A warning would have been nice,
he shouted at Reaper through clenched teeth.
Behind you.
Reaper screamed, after a delay.
Thanks. Got it.
Martonus mumbled. He spun around to face his assailant, knife still protruding from his shoulder, flaring in pain. The butcher stared at him with cold eyes. A small smile grew across his gaunt face, parting the skin that seemed stretched too tight. 2 razor-sharp knives appeared in his hands from behind. Martonus reached up and yanked the gruesome blade from his flesh, gritting his teeth against the pain. He felt power flow through him, knitting the skin back together with shadowed tendrils.
Did you really think an all-black suit and trench coat would label you as anything other than a ministry pawn?
The butcher said, amusement rich on his lips.
Could use some more variety in your choice of clothing.
Am I seriously getting lectured on wardrobe by a blood-soaked butcher and a Faeden right now?
The butcher rushed towards him, lips stretched thin as he screamed with glee. Time seemed to slow as Reaper permeated throughout Martonus' entire being. He felt his blood boil and bones creak as the shadows filled his veins and strengthened his body and soul. Martonus and Reaper's minds may have been shattered slowly and painfully, but their bonded power had never been stronger. Wisps of darkness began to swirl off of his skin, and Reaper's claws ripped out of his flesh, replacing his hands with something far darker and more dangerous. His eyes turned red, and he moved. No, he flowed, like shadow itself, towards the butcher. A look of surprise spread across the man's face as Martonus transformed from a hapless old ministry pawn into something out of a nightmare. Martonus deftly dodged the man's attack and moved to the side, raking shadowed claws through his flesh. The man cried out in pain and jumped away from him.
I see I underestimated you.
He crouched low into a fighting stance, very different from the lazy way he had attacked before, completely ignoring the blood flowing from the gashes in his side.
Allow me to remedy my mistake.
He lunged forward, quicker than Martonus would have assumed possible from such a scrawny man. Reaper urged him to move, to kill. He could have just allowed Reaper to manifest fully in the mortal world, but in such small quarters that would have left Martonus exposed. And so they moved as one. A hunter, a predator, a killer. He lashed out at the butcher as he rapidly closed the distance, striking with hands and claws. Much to Martonus' surprise, the butcher feinted and narrowly dodged out of his strike, while making a narrow slice at the tendon on Martonus' leg. The blade connected, causing his leg to give out from under him. The butcher rushed back in, slamming his full body into Martonus, sending both of them crashing into a nearby countertop. Knives and bloodied meat scattered in every direction. The butcher took advantage of the brief moment of confusion and thrust twin blades towards Martonus' chest. A massive tendril of shadow burst from the butcher's target, impaling him in the gut and sending him hurtling through the back wall of the shack. Wisps of shadow grew in place of Martonus' tendon, not easing the pain, but allowing him to stand. He rushed to his feet and walked towards where the butcher had fallen. Pushing aside the ripped canvas, he found himself in an enclosed pen of sorts, with thin thatched walls and roof. The butcher lay dazed on the ground, surrounded by bare and nearly desiccated forms of people.
What the veil is this?
Martonus said under his breath. He took in the sight, seeing the naked people huddled in corners, crying and whimpering in pain, bleeding from thousands of different cuts and wounds.
It would appear to be the butcher's livestock.
A cold fury flooded over Martonus. He walked towards the butcher, who was struggling to turn himself over. The livestock cowered from them both.
I'm looking for someone. A young man, about this tall, obsessed with blood. You wouldn't happen to know anything about him, would you?
The butcher crawled desperately towards the back wall. Martonus got closer and stomped on the man's leg with the enhanced strength Reaper granted him, shattering bones. He cried out in pain. A shadowed hand erupted from Martonus' own, grabbing the man and slamming him down to the ground facing him.
Where is the boy?
Martonus and Reaper screamed in unison. The look of terror on the man's face was immensely satisfying to them both.
Vastrin! They went to Vastrin!
He cried.
They?
The boy and the old man! Some priest in the brood! The Herald, I think!
The Herald of Crom?
Martonus asked in disbelief.
That's all I know! I swear!
You were quick to betray your loyalty to your god.
The butcher spat blood as he laughed.
Crom is not my god!
There seems to be a lot of that going around.
My people have a mutually beneficial agreement with him. That is all.
Good. Then he won't mind if you die.
That look of horror returned to his face.
No! Wait! Please! Don't kill me!
Martonus smiled, but there was no joy in his eyes. Only morbid satisfaction.
Don't worry. I'm not going to kill you. Reaper, their bonds.
With pleasure.
Tendrils of shadow reached out from Martonus in every direction towards the wretched creatures stored here. The shadows struck at the twine binding their hands and feet. It took several seconds before they realized they were truly free, and for the butcher to realize what they were about to do to him.
No! No! Please! No!
He screamed out to Martonus after he had turned away and walked back into the tent shack. The sounds of screams, breaking bones, and ripping flesh followed.
Their souls, they are linked to the rat.
Martonus stopped, considering briefly, then continued out onto the street.
If you let them live, they will give him strength.
If I die, I die. I'm not going to murder them just to give me an extra advantage.
You've done worse for less.
I've done worse to make the Brokken Empire a better place. This is no longer about the Empire. It's about doing what's right. About finishing what I've started.
Martonus stopped in the street.
Could you track him using that link?
If you brought one of them with you, perhaps.
He turned around and walked back into the shack towards the pen. The scene was grisly, the butcher hardly recognizable as a human. The captives still sat huddled in the corners as if they hadn't just torn apart a man with their bare hands, covered in blood.
There is another man, a man like this one, who has taken your blood for his own gain. I hunt this man, and I could use your help.